First Edition is a ministry of First Community Church, a place of worship for everyone, regardless of religious background. Join us to enhance your spiritual journey and share in God's love and grace. And now, First Edition.
Good morning, and welcome to First Edition, the television ministry of First Community Church. My name is Glen Miles. I'm the senior minister at this amazing congregation, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us for this time of worship. We want you to know, in this church, we accept you as you are. No matter where you are on faith's journey, or even if you're full of doubt, we want you to know we want to partner with you in this time of worship together. My sermon today is based on Acts chapter 16. It tells the story of Paul's encounter with a woman named Lydia outside the city gates of the city of Philippi. Lydia becomes the very first Christian convert on European soil. And what that says to us is that the Spirit of God was at work, broadening and widening and accepting anyone and everyone. The church she forms is a beautiful one where everyone is allowed, soldiers and slaves, rich and poor. It's an amazing story. I'm looking forward to sharing this sermon with you. Let's worship God now. Many of you, during our years together as your pastor, have said to me in one way or another, I come to church on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday evening longing to find something larger than myself. I come looking for the presence of the Spirit, for a sense that there's something sacred at work in the world. I come into this sanctuary hoping that somehow God knows me and that God is inviting me to participate in whatever this large, amazing thing may be. What that says is no matter how beautiful the music, no matter how wonderful the baptisms might be, or the sound of the prayers, or relevancy of the sermon, we come here longing, many, maybe even most of us, longing for a sense of the divine, of the holy, at work in the world. We preachers can get confused about this. Sometimes we think it's about us. And if I can just write the sermon in just such a way and line up my words perfectly and tell the right story and be funny and whatever, then everything's going to work out great. But that's not the point. The point of the sermon is for me to extend your gaze to the holy, to the presence of heaven, which is as close as our next breath. Really, the point of the worship service itself, the music, the anthems, the prayers, everything, is to move us to that place where we experience something holy and greater than ourselves. Rachel Held Evans, whose book Inspired is part of the inspiration for my sermon series, Inspired, she points out to us that sometimes we need to rediscover the Bible, to find that we can have a conversation with it. And in that conversation, we can be moved to maybe have an experience of the Spirit. Even not only the good parts, but also the ugly parts. And there's some ugly things in the Bible. But in that conversation, we might discover something new about God's presence in our very lives. She says, and I'm quoting her now, we want to do that while avoiding a strict literalism and a safe, disinterested liberalism. Well, that's the part that speaks to us. You see, we progressive Christians, especially me, we tend to live in our heads. We tend to think that if I can just understand it and explain it and get the words lined up perfectly, then our work is done. We can go out and do all the things that we now understand. It's just only half of the experience. What we're being invited to today in the text that we heard in this entire worship service is to connect our heads to our hearts. And in the connection, maybe find the presence of God is that close. Annie Dillard wrote the book, Holy the Firm. It's a meditative narrative that highlights the life and the writings of the mystic Julian of Norwich. It's a beautiful book. It's a very thin little volume. I read it when I was in seminary 30 years ago, but I had to read it 3 or 4 times to really just barely begin to understand and comprehend what she was inviting us to consider. And in fact, I have a quote for you this morning that I want to put up on the screen there. You can see it before you. Here is the fringy edge where elements meet and realms mingle, where time and eternity spatter each other with foam. Here is the fringy edge. I tried to memorize this all week long and getting ready for the sermon, and I couldn't get her meter and her timing down because it's so dense and so beautiful. What would happen if we could find the courage we need to live at that fringy edge? That's what the Apostle Paul's done throughout his life, at least his life as a follower of Jesus. Remember, he has a conversion experience where he's literally knocked down by a vision of Jesus. His friends hear thunder and see nothing and hear nothing, but Paul sees and hears Jesus, and he completely redirects his life and goes in a fully different way, the way of Christ, the way of grace, peace, and love. And then here on his missionary journey, he has a dream, a vision, a fringy, edgy kind of thing. You see, he had a plan. He and his companions had a plan. They were in what is now modern-day Turkey. They were going to go to this city, then the next city, then the next, and they had it all worked out. They probably had maps in hand. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then in the middle of the night, he's awakened by a dream. And a man from Macedonia, that's Greece today, this man says, "We need you here. Come with your words of Jesus. Come with your words on the way of love and grace. Come to us." Courageously, he redirects. He heads west. He moves toward Philippi, where he finds himself outside of the city gates a few days later, in a beautiful area where he meets Lydia and her companions. It seemed to them to be a place of prayer. And so Paul sits down. Now, Luke is the author of the book of Acts. Notice what happens. We hear Paul sits down. Does it mean anything to us? 2,000 years ago, when the teacher was ready to teach, he would be seated, and his students would be seated at his feet. Who are his students? Lydia and her friends, her female companions. This is a remarkable thing in antiquity. The teacher is his first time on European soil, the first time that the Christian faith has been brought to the continent of Europe, and the very first ones that are being taught are women. Luke is saying this movement, this way, this church is a completely different kind of community of faith. All the distinctions are left aside, and the Spirit works to bring everyone into place. And then notice this one named Lydia. We don't know a lot about her, but what we do know is remarkable. She is the head of the household. She is very wealthy. She's a seller of purple. That means she's in the top 10%, maybe even in the top 1%, because that's who she would be selling her purple to, are those who are in the highest social strata of the day. And she's the very first Christian convert on European soil. Again, the Spirit is moving and saying, do you see how this God works? How this God is working in and among the world? The church, the doors of the church are wide open to anyone and everyone. And then Lydia really becomes the model for Christian leadership. She's baptized. And following her baptism, she invites Paul and his companions to stay with her in her home. It's a gracious act of hospitality. She's a model for what Christian leadership looks like. I read a scholar this week who said Christian leadership has nothing to do with power or privilege or place. Christian leadership is seen in meeting the needs of the community of faith and the broader community in which the church resides. Leadership in the church means if there's a need, the ones who are leaders are to go and meet that need. That means if our facilities team is sick this week and we need people to clean the bathrooms, I, as the senior pastor and the leaders of our church, we're going to be cleaning bathrooms this week. That's what leadership means. That's the way that Lydia models for all of us. The place where she was baptized is a beautiful one. I've been there. My wife, Julie, and I led a group of about 40 people from Kansas City on the footsteps of Paul tour through the country of Greece and a little bit over into Turkey. We spent one day at the ancient ruins of Philippi, and then we traveled a very short distance outside the gates to the traditional spot where it said that Lydia was baptized. I want you to see how beautiful it is. Put it up here on the screen. It's a calming, precious, quiet place. It was easy to imagine that would be a place of prayer. Leave it up on the screen for a few moments, if you guys will, please. A calming place, a place of prayer. If you look in the opposite direction from the camera, looking behind me from where I took that photo, you would see on the other side that an amphitheater had been built around a bend in this little creek, and there was a poured concrete overlay covering the water with a cutout in the shape of a large cross. That was the place that tradition said Lydia would have been baptized, and there many people, many pilgrims from all around the world go there to be baptized or to confirm their baptism again. It's a precious spot. But when I turned away from the concrete and looked out at this gorgeous scene, it was a moment I'm a jaded preacher. I've been around. I don't get caught up in stuff too much, but boy, I got to tell you, I had goosebumps. It felt like the Spirit was there. I could imagine that something happened there 2,000 years ago. Just a short walk from this beautiful spot, you can go and stand on the stones of an ancient Roman road built before the time of Paul, and most certainly walked on by Paul and his companions. I just felt like it was amazing. It's what the Celtics call a thin place, a place where this world and the other world meld together and find themselves experiencing something new. The Spirit, Lydia, and Paul. I'm getting goosebumps just telling this story. You know, I'm convinced that this desire for something sacred, this wish, this dream for something holier than ourselves is connected ultimately to the dream of home. To having a place where we know we're accepted, where we're known by name, and we don't have to be anyone else other than the one that God created us to be. Pat Conroy, the novelist, has one of his characters say, "I could not quiet the pearly ache in my heart that I diagnosed as the desire for home." Sometimes, though, we confuse this longing for something sacred and holier beyond ourselves with the desire to do something important that will be recognized by the world, that can be even life-changing for dozens or hundreds or thousands or even more than that. And we dream of being on the cover of the New York Times, not for bad reasons, but for good reasons. Or, well, maybe that dream is too big, or at least being the lead article in the First News newsletter of First Community Church every month, to be shown as doing something great and glorious and wonderful. Preachers are the worst at this, trust me. We dream of these kinds of things all the time. I dream of being the great and glorious Grand Poobah of all amazing things in the Church Universal. You can call me Grand Poobah if you want to later on. It's silly, but you understand the point I'm making. Sometimes we get confused with those kinds of desires with that simpler, quieter dream of being together with God's people in the presence of the Spirit. I remember a time when I thought one of those big dreams was coming true. I was invited to be the keynote speaker on the opening night of the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, meeting in Orlando, Florida. The year was 2013. I was nervous as a cat. I was in the green room. You know the green room? That's where performers go before they come out on stage. It's all painted in green. The idea is that here you can relax, take a deep breath. Even the idea of it being green is that green is a calming color and it makes it easier. It didn't matter. I was just nervous as all get out. And it wasn't really the sermon and the delivery of it that was causing me to be nervous. It was the content of the sermon. I'd rehearsed it all afternoon. I had it learned. I knew what I was going to say. I was clear, but the content had some stuff that I knew would upset some folks. I was going to be calling for the clear inclusion of the LGBTQ community as pastors in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which, by the way, is the denomination which I'm ordained. It's one of our 2 affiliate denominations here at First Community. I knew that about 20% of the room, and there were 5,000 people there, I knew about 20% of the room was going to vote against what I was going to be calling on in 3 days. It was in my sermon. I was also calling on the congregation to pay attention to the fact that the culture is rapidly changing around us. Our denomination was stuck in the 1930s and stuck in a variety of ways, and it was time to name that and get over it and find out how we can be a new voice in the world today. So basically, I had a sermon that was going to irritate 5,000 people in the convention center. This kind woman came in. She was the host of the green room. She came in and said, "Would you like some water?" "No, ma'am, thank you. I'm okay." 5 minutes later, she came in. "Would you like a cookie?" I'm okay, thank you. I don't need a cookie." Okay. She comes back in again. I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak. And tell me about again where you're from. And I said, please, you're very kind. I just need a moment of quiet. "Of course," she said. She was quite gracious. She was the Lydia of the convention. Quite gracious. She left. I took a deep breath, and I looked down. When I looked up, my dad was standing there. My dad had died 2 years before. He smiled. He said, "I'm proud of you. Go preach." Now you need to know, my dad was a minimalist when it came to giving compliments or encouragements. I remember playing a basketball game in high school where I did pretty well. We won the game. My dad's first words to me afterwards in the car on the way home, "You need a haircut. You look terrible when you get sweaty out there on the court." All he said in the green room, "I'm proud of you. Go preach." You know, for 9 years I've wondered if part of the work of the Spirit on that day was not just bringing me and the word that I had to share, well, it was bringing my dad back to me to share a simple word. You see, Paul and Lydia begin something new, something amazing, something incredible. They start a church where all that social strata that I talked about earlier in the sermon doesn't matter. All that stuff, as important as it was or seemed to be in Roman society in those days, that was all checked at the door. The church became the church that Lydia founded, and the churches that followed in her footsteps were churches where slaves and soldiers would sit next to each other. There were churches where collectors of fine art would sit next to carpenters, where rich and poor would leave aside all those differences, gathered around a common table, a common faith in the love and hope of Jesus Christ. It was in the church where all that stuff on the outside was pushed away. Paul even wrote to one church and said, "Greet each other with a holy kiss." Now, if a slave were to kiss his owner or anyone else in a section above him, which would be everyone else, he could be put to death on the spot, but not in the church. In the church, there was no distinction that way. Everyone was welcome. In the church, they were one. Paul wrote to another church and he said, "There is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female." We need to hear that word clearly these days, male or female. No, you are all one. And the church for 200 years thrived. Now I know some of you might be wondering this morning, my God, Glenn, there's white supremacy is everywhere. It's raised its ugly head. It's murderous. It's hateful. It's racist. It's made its way into the pews of our churches, into the halls of our city governments, into the Capitol in Washington, D.C., for God's sake. And you're talking about dreams and visions and all this other woo-woo stuff. We've got work to do. And my response is this: yes. And let us remember that the civil rights movement coalesced and founded the courage that it needed back in the 1960s when Martin Luther King stood up in Washington, D.C. and said, "I have a dream." And in the dream, they found the courage, they found the hope that they needed to go forward and take on the evil of segregation, of racism in this land. I have a dream for this church. Can we dream? Can we dream of a church where all those distinctions are laid aside? Can we dream of a church that will respond to the vicious ugliness of racism, of white supremacy in our land by uniting together not in hate or anger, but in grace, in love, in hope? Can we dream of a church that is fueled by grace, amazing grace? In the name of Jesus Christ, let it be so.